All right. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Ultimate Potential, a mental health podcast, the podcast that's all about helping you feel good, feel better.
That's right. My name's Craig Lamont, and
I'm Tony Mosier.
we are here today, and for our first podcast where we didn't have an outside guest. So we're going to kind of talk about happiness today. Our lives, right? Our professional lives, the two of us, we have specialized in trying to help people find happiness, and it's part of the intervention that we do with youth is to help them to feel more happiness in their life. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, but sometimes, you go to conferences and workshops, and every once in a while somebody will say, "What's your mission? What's your life's mission?" And the first half of my career, I really struggled with that until I really boiled it down to two things. The purpose of my life is to increase joy and decrease suffering.
Yeah.
Right. Whatever that may be. And it just so happens that being a mental health therapist, so much of that has to do with what goes on in our relationships and what goes on between our ears. So yeah, happiness, something that seems more and more like it's in short supply.
So it's such a blessing. The reason why I love my work is because when I'm driving to work every day, I actually get excited. I get excited about what I do, but I also get excited about who I'm with, right? And so being in the workplace with you and with our, the other people that work here with us, it's always fun to find out. I get excited about learning new stuff, right? So we went to this conference, Tony and I, and like most conferences that we go to, he's presenting at these conferences, and I never know what he's got cooked up. And you did a presentation recently on happiness, which is one of the main reasons why we wanted to talk about it today, because I was very impressed with what I learned from this conference, which I could have learned just by going to lunch with you. But we're going to talk about it a little bit today.
Well, yeah, and I want to give credit where credit is due. Most of this material comes from a researcher named Sonia Lyubomirsky. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
And she's out of the University of California, Riverside. And this essentially, the National Institute of Mental Health commissioned a study. The government wanted to know what creates happiness. Now, some questions are questions of faith, like, is there a God? Other questions are questions of opinion, like, is Nickelback a good band, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on who you ask. And then there are some questions that can be answered empirically, which means they're answered by research and study and by statements of fact, right?
Right.
So when I was a newlywed, or actually before I was married, I wanted to be a great husband, so I went around to all these old codgers in my life, all the old people, and I had my little notebook, and I said, well, what's going to create happiness? How am I going to be a great husband? How am I going to be a great father? How am I going to be happiness in life? Because I had seen many, many people struggle to find happiness, my own parents included. And I got all kinds of answers. I got, take lots of walks, exercise, she's always right was one of them that a lot of people said. Don't go to bed angry. And, it was all conventional wisdom, and it was probably good advice. But being a scientific guy and an empirical guy, I just often wondered what is really the science of happiness. And not until I came across this researcher's work did I really learn what science tells us happiness is. And beyond like the neurochemicals, we're talking about behaviors, things you can actually do in your life that can increase or decrease your happiness.
Yeah. So you're saying you can affect it or control it?
You can. And in fact, the U.S. government commissioned this study, and they said, we will give you $1 million to go out and look at all the research that's ever been done on happiness compile all that research, tell us the common threads between all of it, and do additional research as well. So that's what she and her team did. And what she found is that to a point, you can increase or decrease your happiness based on your will or your behavior, which was a little bit disheartening to me because I think we all want to believe that, you know, happiness is about your attitude. If you have a positive attitude, if you have a happy disposition, if you look at the bright side of life, then you're going to be happy. And what the research actually found is that everybody has a happiness set point.
Yeah.
Kind of like,
Kind of like how tall you are, or how
like your
good you are.
metabolism,
Yeah.
your
Yep.
like your happiness set point. And you get that from your parents. You get that genetically. It's just the hand you're dealt. And so some people, you know, they have a lower happiness set point and they just genetically tend to struggle to be happy. Some people have, and we all know those sometimes annoyingly happy people that just no matter what happens, they're just through the roof happy. And sometimes that is a genetic gift. But actually, about 50% of our happiness is from our genetics.
Okay.
Then 10% of our happiness is actually our life circumstances. So the things that happen to us.
Okay.
You win the lottery, you break your leg, you get a divorce, you get your dream job, whatever it is, only 10% of our happiness is controlled by the things that are outside
Stuff.
of our control, the
Yeah.
stuff that happens to us. So half of your happiness is who you are. 10% of your happiness is what happens to you. And then there's 40% of your happiness that is actually the buttons and the levers that you
choose.
can choose, right?
Or you can learn skills or whatever.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
And so this researcher started calling this the 40% solution, meaning, you know, don't despair that your happiness is kind of dealt genetically because 40% is a lot. That's
Yeah,
a
it
big
is.
piece of the pie, right?
Yeah.
And based on what you believe, what you think, what you do, you have a lot of control over where that happiness level ends up. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, there's something called they found called hedonistic adaptation.
So what's that? That's some crazy word.
Yeah, it took a little while for me to understand it. Hedonistic adaptation is, have you ever had something happen in your life that is a circumstance? It's what part of that 10%, right? But it actually made you feel better. It made you feel happier, like for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So, for example, I was, my wife and I, we built the dream house, right? We lived in the little starter home, and then we lived in the 1970s home that you kind of make do with.
Right.
And then eventually we build the dream home. And I move into the dream home, and it was beautiful and clean and all the right colors and everything. The layout was just like we wanted. And I felt legitimately happier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I would come home and it lasted. It lasted for months and months and maybe more than a year. But eventually it kind of wore off,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, like it does. And eventually I found myself about as happy as I was in the old house. And that was about as happy as I was in the house before. And that was about as happy as I was when I was living in an apartment,
Right.
you know, in college.
Right.
So hedonistic adaptation is this tendency that we have that we can have something happen and it'll give us a bump in happiness, and it can last up to 2 years.
Okay.
But by about 2 years, you're back to your baseline.
So if I lose a bunch of weight and I feel happy, that might
Right.
only last for 2 years.
Right. So
Or if I buy a new car, or
Right.
whatever it is,
the new
right?
relationship, the better job, whatever it is.
Okay.
Hedonistic adaptation also happens in reverse.
Okay.
So when something happens that's crappy in your life, right? You get in the car accident, or you get in a bad relationship. That can actually decrease your happiness level significantly. But within about 2 years, you're back to where you were.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
There's something about that genetic baseline that is so powerful. It's like gravity.
Like
It's
pulling you
magnetic. It
back.
just
Yeah.
pulls us right back there. So the question became, is there anything we can do that can actually increase or decrease our happiness by that 40%, and it can guard against hedonistic adaptation, meaning we can be happier and we can be permanently happier.
Let me ask it, because people believe, we all believe, and whether it's dopamine cycle or whatever it is, people believe that if I can just get that,
Yeah.
then I'll be happy. If I could just win this, or if I could just be better at that, or if I could just go shopping and have that outfit or that haircut or whatever it is, right? If I could just make the varsity team or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
then they think that that leads to happiness, right? And what you're saying is it might lead to happiness for a while, but it doesn't lead to long-term happiness.
Right.
So it becomes a myth. What other myths are there?
That's a good question. They found a lot of myths about happiness. I mean, typically when most people are asked what creates happiness, what does everybody want? They want money,
They want money.
right? They want money. They want fame. They want to look different. Sometimes parents will say, you know, a parent is only as happy as their least happy child, right? We believe that we're kind of connected in that way. The first myth, the top myth, is that happiness has to be found, that it's out there, that you have to go out on some quest and climb up, you know, some mountain and find the guru at the top, and that happiness lies in the better relationship, the better job, the more money, the losing the weight. What they found is those things don't create lasting happiness. It's
Okay.
not out there, right? At least the 40% that we're talking about. The other myth is that happiness lies in changing our circumstances, right? And then finally, the third myth is that happiness has to be either you have it or you don't. You know, that it's something that's static.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there's happy people in this world and there's miserable people, and
Right.
I'm one of the miserable people. That's my lot in life. And that's simply not true, right?
Yeah.
So it boiled down to these 12 things, actually 12 things that you can do
Okay.
or not do that can increase or decrease your happiness permanently.
Long term, permanently,
Long-term.
not just for the 2 years or 1 to 2 days, right?
Right.
Okay. All right.
Well, I'll go through these things.
Okay.
And I'm going to do a little exclaimer. When I heard these things, my first impression was, well, no duh. Like, this is, some of it was the same advice that the old codgers gave me when I was
Right.
a young man. The cynical part of me was like, that's too simple. It's too simple. Like, I mean, that's like greeting card wisdom,
Yeah.
right? But the science behind it is valid, and I was able to do a deep dive into all of the studies that are replicated over not just years but decades that show that these 12 things truly are the 12 things.
Right.
The first one, interestingly, is gratitude, expressing gratitude.
Not just having it, but expressing it.
That's a good question. The studies that I looked at, the expression of gratitude
Right.
was part of the study.
Yeah.
So, for example, they took, you know, a control group of people. They measured their happiness levels. They took another group of people, measured their happiness levels. One group, they sent them out and they said, just think of somebody in your life that has changed your life for the better, somebody you're grateful for, somebody that maybe you wouldn't normally have an opportunity to express that gratitude, right? Maybe the old teacher that you lost touch with.
Right.
And then do a handwritten letter of gratitude.
Right.
And then find a way to get that to that person. And then they measured, you know, the groups 2 weeks later, and surprise, surprise,
Right.
the ones who'd expressed gratitude were significantly happier and had less depression than those who hadn't. So I think the expression of gratitude is
Yeah.
part of it. But I mean, in recovery, right, with substance use, the most correlated feature of staying clean is expressing gratitude. That's why most recovery programs have gratitude journals
Right.
actually built in. In fact, at Telos,
Right.
we have we have an app that our parents use, and it's actually a gratitude journal, right? That they go in and share what they're grateful for, because it changes everything,
Right.
right? Second, optimism, cultivating optimism. So this would be, it's a little bit like you, Craig. It makes me, so for our listeners, you know, Craig and I are a little bit of a yin and a yang, and it works, right? When we started Telos, I was the guy that was afraid, and I was convinced that we were going to fail. And I saw a monster around every corner, you know, ready to jump out and get us. And Craig was just blind to those monsters.
Yeah.
He saw bunny rabbits and unicorns and happy things, right? And I used to think that that was naive, or short-sighted, or maybe reckless. But what I realize now is that, Craig, you have a gift, you have a strength naturally that I don't have, and that is optimism comes naturally for you.
Yeah, it does.
I don't know if you have to work at it, but you're an optimistic guy. Every time I come into a meeting with Craig, I say, "Oh, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? What about this, you know, big scary problem?" Craig will typically say, "Well, you know, let's talk some solutions." And then he'll say, "But you know, everything's going to be okay. I mean, 99% chance this will work itself out anyway."
Right.
And guess what? It does.
Yeah.
Right. One research project, it gathered up all of many people at the end of their life, you know, on their deathbed, and asked them, "What's your regret? What's your biggest regret?" And I think I would have thought that people would say, "Well, you know, I never made peace with my daughter," or "I was a workaholic." But the number one regret of people at the end of their life is they say, "I just wish I wouldn't have worried so much,"
Yeah.
because everything worked out.
Mm-hmm.
Even the things that didn't work out, they worked out.
They worked out.
And it's all beautiful. It's part of what's made me who I am, and it's welcome, and it's beautiful, and I wouldn't change anything.
The old people say that.
Yeah.
The ones who died don't get to say
Yeah,
that.
that's right, the old people. So I, as I find myself in my worried mind, where I tend to cultivate pessimism, I often think about that, and I think, you know, there's a lot of unnecessary suffering that happens because of anxiety, especially about the anxiety and the pessimism and the cycling through the things that we ultimately can't control.
Right. So focus on what you can control instead of what you can't control, but really trying to see the upside rather than the downside.
So let me ask you, Craig, how do you maintain that optimism? What's your secret?
You know, I've thought about that a lot because I've you know, lots of people comment on it, and I think I know my own strengths, but one of the things, like you said, I think maybe I was born with it. Maybe I wasn't. I remember being around very optimistic. My mother was just like, you could just never get her down. So maybe I learned it from my mom. I'd love to give her credit for that. Right. I remember just, when I was in grade school, you know, back in the old 8-track days, and my mom would plug in these motivational speaker things, you know, this optimistic, just training my brain. And she was just relentless in trying to help me to see the positive side. So I would probably give most of the learned credit to my mother. But I really don't know the answer to how. I do know, like your presentation and like books and I mean, there are some structured ways, right? As therapists, as a community sports coach, like there's all sorts of sports psychology ways and clinical ways to get people to think optimistically through, you know, checking their negative thoughts and you know,
All the cognitive,
all the cognitive behavioral stuff, and even the DBT stuff, right? Like it's all there and capable, but for me, it's just been easy. Things stick with me.
That might be part of your 50% genetic
It
gift.
might be, yeah.
Right? But it's interesting to me that the first thing of expressing gratitude, how closely related that is to cultivating optimism.
Yes.
I mean, they're really brother and sister.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
which brings us to the third thing. In that same vein, it's avoiding overthinking and comparison.
Yeah.
I have a son, bless his heart, who he's always been an overthinker, a
Yeah.
chronic overthinker. He'd lay in bed at night and just stare at the ceiling, wouldn't get any sleep, and his mind would race. He would think about everything from, all the anxieties and the what ifs to the regrets. And he did a lot of thinking about eternity and the universe and how is the universe constantly expanding and what is infinity. And he just couldn't turn it off.
Right.
These intrusive, this mind racing.
Yeah.
And as I've watched him, I've seen that sometimes he's struggled, with optimism
Yeah.
and with happiness. There are some people that they just their brain is going a mile a minute and they can't turn it down. They can't turn it off. And I think those people struggle more,
Yeah, they
to
do.
be happy. Inviting comparison, right? When you look at social media, you look at the rise of smartphones, you look at the levels of depression that they've tracked. And as social media has come online, depression levels have steadily gone up and they've mirrored social media consumption. I mean, there's something so toxic about seeing everybody's life,
Only
in
the highlights.
all the highlights with just
Yeah.
the right filters,
Yeah.
just in your face all day, every day.
Yep.
When you know the reality is you're comparing your private failures against everybody else's public successes.
It's really hard though, because in our culture, religious or non-religious or wherever, like it's an integral part of most people's parenting style, right? Is to compare. You
Yeah.
compare siblings, or you compare to and sometimes well-meaning parents, they don't know any better other than to learn from comparisons of what
Yeah.
other parents, right? And then there's like the hell of growing up in junior high and just normal, you're just constantly being fed. And in our society, we're sports crazed, or
Yeah.
performance crazed. And so it's a constant comparison. Like everything, right? Our grading systems, you name it. So inherently, we all learn very well how to compare to one another, but it's hurtful,
Yeah.
right? And it definitely doesn't lead to happiness. So, once you get to be a teenager or an adult, you can actually learn the skills to stop doing that,
Yeah.
right? To stop hyper focusing on it,
Yeah.
at least.
And it's funny, you'd think that me being a therapist and all, I'd be able to practice what I preach, but I'm a person of faith. I go to church on Sunday. Some people go to synagogue, some people, wherever it is they go. But for me, church has become, something that should make me feel good, right? It's there to kind of recharge your batteries spiritually. It's become something sometimes when I let it, something that drains my batteries because it's the dog and pony show.
Yeah.
You go there and everybody's lined up and you can't help but kind of look from pew to pew and be like, man, that family seems like they have it all together. Those kids seem so polished. Man, that kid's off to Yale with a scholarship, and this kid's got lacrosse trophies all over
Right.
his room. And man, what's going on with my home? Right?
Right.
What's going on with my kids?
Right.
And I think that we become conditioned to give ourselves a grade. We grade ourselves by how much wealth we have. We grade ourselves by our physical appearance. We grade ourselves by our vacations, by how well behaved or accomplished our children are, the cars we drive, the grades we get. And social media is just a delivery method
Yeah.
that gets that to us all the time in your face. Your phone literally vibrates and you pick it up and there it is, reminding you that you're less.
So the first one, expression of gratitude, is a proactive do this. The second one is proactive do this, be an optimist. The third one is don't do this.
Yeah.
Right? It's don't overthink stuff and stop comparing yourself to other people,
Yeah.
which will then lead to long-term happiness.
I remember one time I was asked one of those would you rather questions. Would you rather be a brilliant but tortured genius? or would you rather be a really happy but kind of simple-minded oaf, right? Like,
Yeah.
and at the time when I was younger, I was like, oh, the unexamined life isn't worth living. I want to be the
Yeah.
tortured genius. I want to make it some significance in the world. But you know what? Oftentimes the people that change the world in the most significant ways, especially that quietly change the world one life at a time, are people who, I don't want to say they're simple-minded, but they've somehow been able to turn off a piece of their intellect and their cognition and quiet their mind,
Yeah. Yeah.
and just be present.
Yeah. What's number 4?
Number 4, acts of kindness.
Okay.
So all the things that our parents told us, be kind and share and, look for the kid on the playground that doesn't have any friends and go invite him to be in the game. And those little acts of kindness create happiness. I have a friend who, he was traveling internationally, and he was on a long layover in Istanbul, and he sat there. He saw a woman sitting on the side of the not sitting on the side of the airport lobby lounge. She was crying, and he walked over and kind of sat down next to her and said, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need any help? Are you?" And she, thanked him for stopping, and she shared what she was upset about, and then she mentioned that she had had this horrible news, right? And she had been sitting there for 3 hours in, having this kind of this breakdown.
Right.
And in 3 hours of literally thousands of people walking by, he was the first one,
Yeah.
the first person to stop. And so there is something so powerful about acts of kindness,
Yeah.
revolutionary about
Yeah.
acts of kindness.
It was really cool. Last night, we went up for Memorial Day to visit our fathers, right? My wife and I, both of our fathers are still alive and both really old. And my dad had been fishing. He can't hardly walk. He's got advanced cancer, and he's wobbly, and he has his cane, and he had been fishing off of a deck. And he caught a fish. He was reeling it in, and as he's pulling the fish up, he finds something in his mouth, and he's like, something, like, I don't know if something came out of the water or whatever. Well, it turns out to be his tooth, the dentist, the $1,000 tooth of the dentist that just re-put in because the chemo, his teeth are falling out, right? So he spits it out because he doesn't know what it is, and it goes into the swamp, right? And so he spends the whole day convincing me to go down with a shovel and and this,
Like panning for gold.
Just like panning for gold. And I knew I wasn't going to find the tooth, but just because he's my dad and I respect him, and he's an old man, and might be his last dying wish, who knows? So I was, as soon as we went there, I had my little screen and my bucket and my shovel and the little clippers to clip off the all the junk. And there was a family there fishing in that same spot where he was fishing. And they quickly vacated. And it didn't take even 3 seconds for the dad and his 2 sons to drop their fishing poles and completely just all they wanted to do is help us find that tooth. And they all knew that we weren't going to find it. Well, the little boy probably didn't. But it was just interesting how fast that these 3 people were interested in being kind to my dad, who was just happy as a bird to have people helping him find his tooth, with a big old smile, but a missing tooth. Yeah. It was fun.
One of the studies behind this truism, acts of kindness, was they took a bunch of women who were terminally ill, and they took some of them at random. They chose them to be helpers, where those women would go around and just do these little acts of kindness and acts of support for the other women who were also dying. And then they measured their depression and happiness levels, right? 30 days later, and surprise, surprise, right? Those who were engaged in regular acts of kindness, not just a little bit happier,
a lot,
profoundly happier,
yeah,
right? So moving on, number 5 out of the 12 things is nurturing relationships. Happy people, they invest in their relationships.
It's not just passive relationships,
It's
but
not.
they do something.
They do something, and they know that quality time, oftentimes, is a natural byproduct of quantity time. We often say, well, I'm going to schedule some quality time between 9 and 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday with my kids. And then you spend that time and it ends up not being quality time.
Right.
But then, when you go camping or you just spend the time or you're home for the long weekend and you have those little magical moments that, the water fight in the yard or baking bread, and, whatever happens, it's boring, it's routine, but it ends up being that special talk that you have with a child you need to reconnect with. That quality time is the byproduct of quantity time. So putting in the work, doing the work,
Yeah.
so that you can actually have face time
Yeah.
with people, not just your family, but people. Investing in relationships.
Like the old commercial, where it talks about parenting or whatever. He says it's just about time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then we have number 6 is coping strategies. Happy people, distressing things happen to them. Problems happen. They cry, they get angry, they get discouraged, they feel hopeless. But they have a toolbox that they can open, and in there are some coping strategies. Whether it's mindfulness, learning how to quiet your mind, whether it's a safe person, a safe place, a safe activity, exercise. I was thinking about doing one of these podcasts on a type of coping skill that I use called the ABCs, Albert Ellis's ABCs, which is a cognitive tool that I use that really has helped me reduce a lot of the unnecessary anxiety in my life. Maybe that's for another day, but that's something that good therapy. I mean, if you're struggling finding coping skills,
Yep.
or if the things that you've always done aren't working anymore, good therapy can help you, give you some real tools. If you open that toolbox and it's empty,
Yeah.
or the tools are broken,
Yeah. Awareness isn't enough.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Next is forgiveness. I didn't expect this one to be on there, but now that once I saw it, it doesn't surprise me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Happy people have found a way to let go of enmity and resentment and hatred and pain. They found the ability to forgive, which is not to say that they found the ability to give people permission to hurt them,
Right.
Or to say that something that happened was okay.
Yeah. It doesn't mean that they have to go back and put themselves at risk
Yeah.
or things, but they have to forgive.
And they're able to forgive independent of the perpetrator feeling sorry or apologizing.
Yep.
Right.
Interesting. A recent podcast about the families of the murder victims, the young kids that got killed up here by Park City or Camas, a few years ago, and how they went through the court systems and all the trials, and the families of these victims just started falling apart, right? Just falling apart. And then all of a sudden they got a letter, right, from the perpetrator, and it kind of changed everything. And the mindset of forgiveness started to come in, and it's a very interesting podcast, but really fun and inspiring, I think. Yeah.
There's actually a lot of research behind a practice called restorative justice. New Zealand actually took their whole youth corrections, judicious youth court system, and they did away with it and brought in this philosophy and practice called restorative justice. And it's the idea that most of the time when you take a perpetrator and a victim, the courts want to separate them. And then there's attorneys that keep them apart, and the attorneys talk to the attorneys, and the perpetrator never really gets to see how they affected the victim. And the victim never really gets to understand the humanity of the perpetrator. And most of all, the thing that was broken never gets restored.
Right.
So restorative justice is this idea that let's try to bring them together with some protections in place and work on restoration.
Right.
Work on healing.
Yeah.
and it's pretty powerful. So moving on, number 8 is happy people have found ways to increase their flow experiences.
Okay. This sounds fun.
What would you say a flow experience is, Craig? How would you define that?
Well, because I've worked also in the sports psychology area, right? A flow experience is something where you just you can you can experience something and perform something without having to work really hard mentally for it. It just kind of happens, and that usually comes from practice and practice and practice, and really gaining competence, right, in something. So artists can do it, and singers, musicians, athletes, architects. I mean, writers. You name it. Like any kind of task or experience that you can do, and be in flow, is, interestingly enough, you can get in flow state even in card games. Like we have a 50-year-old traditional card game that we play with all of our family and relatives. And man, when you're in flow, it just doesn't matter what the deck gives you. When you're flowing, you can win, right?
Yeah.
And when you're not, you're just flustered. It's the
Yeah.
most frustrating game ever, right? But because you're not in flow state.
So a lot of people describe flow experiences as activities that, number one, restore, right?
Yeah.
But they often describe losing track of place and time.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing something, and all of a sudden you look up at the clock, and it's been an hour or 2 hours. And
Yep.
You're like, wow, that felt like 5 minutes.
Yep.
And you're right. For some people, it's painting. For some people, it's surfing. For some people, you've loved to mountain bike.
Yeah.
I'm sure that mountain biking coming down
It's
the
just-
hill is a
yep.
flow experience until you crash. Then it's a
That I'm not in flow.
no.
I mean, interestingly enough, right? They named the trail flow. That there's a style of downhill mountain biking called flow riding,
Oh, really?
and a normal downhill mountain bike, you follow natural terrain and trails, which are not easy to go down in a man-made contraption, right?
Uh-huh.
No matter how good the bike is, it takes a certain technical skill. Then there's another type of downhill where they come in with the tractors, and everything is perfectly by rhythm and timed. They have the berms built up, and so that it lets gravity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you trust the builders of the trail and your own skills, you go into flow on the flow trails, and you don't have to ever use your brakes or pedal or anything. The mountain just kind of takes you through.
Yeah,
the
I would bite the
experience.
dust so hard on that. I'd come to the first jump, and I'd be like, no, and I'd slam on the brakes.
Anyway, so, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's deliberate. Our lives get so busy, and I'm looking at Rachel, one of our producers here across the room, and she's a brilliant artist, and she spent a lot of her life helping young people express emotions that are difficult to put into words through art. I love to write poetry. I mean, everybody has their thing, their creative outlet, and it's so easy for us to let that die in
Yeah,
our
it is.
lives.
Yeah.
Life comes in and smothers those things. Sometimes they're the very first to go.
Yeah.
When the kids come, right? You lose your flow experiences. So finding a way to take care of yourself and increase your flow experience is super important. Number 9 is savoring life's joys, right? Just being present.
Yep.
That mindfulness, just being able to say,
This is nice.
we always do that. Like, well, when I'm graduated, then I'll be so much better. I'll be happier. Then I'm so lonely when I'm married, when I find the right person. Or, then it's, as soon as the kids are out of the house, then that'll be great. And then it's like, we're empty nesters. As soon as we get grandkids, then life will get really
Right.
great. And there's always a reason.
Yeah.
There's always a reason to be unhappy.
Yeah.
Happy people have developed this awareness of what's around them right now, in this moment, in this room,
Yeah.
wherever you are.
Yep.
And they enjoy it.
Yep.
They might enjoy the movement of the air. They might enjoy the sounds, the smells, the person they're with. And oftentimes these people who savor life's joys, when you're with them, they feel very present.
I love to get to know people. One of the things that just makes me smile internally is when I'm talking to somebody, and I ask them, "What's your favorite season of the year?" my favorite answer is all the seasons, right? Because they can see the beauty of the snow or of the,
Yep.
it's just, no, it doesn't matter, if you love spring flowers, but only spring flowers, then maybe you're not going to savor life's joys in the
Yeah.
fall or
Yeah.
in the winter or in the summer. Yeah.
Love it. Number 10 out of 12, commit to your goals, but commit to the right goals. So happy people, they just have something they're working toward. They did one study, though, where they took, this is a lot, 18,000 Harvard students, undergrads, and they had them express what their goals were, right? Write them down. Then they went and revisited those people 8 years later, after graduation, after they were getting into their careers. And what they found is that the students who had goals that were about developing themselves and about, they were more emotionally focused goals or altruistic type goals, were significantly happier and had less mental illness than those who had goals that were centered around materialism and money.
Yeah.
So we live in a world that's, kind of addicted to consumerism and most people, when they think goals, they think this is how much I want in my savings. This is how much I want in my portfolio. And I want to get to a point where I don't have to work and I don't have to worry. That's one of those elusive things that happiness just isn't connected to.
Right.
As much as we maybe want it to be, because you can count it, you can touch it, you can hold it. They've even done studies with lottery winners.
Yeah.
And what they find is that about 2 years after winning the lottery,
Right.
hedonistic adaptation has taken a hold of them.
That's right.
And they're right back to however miserable they were or happy before they won the lottery.
Yeah, the grit book, studying grit, has a lot of science, behind this whole idea of stick to something. If you're
Yeah.
working on something, stick to it, because you're going to fail, you're going to have hardships, but stick to it anyway.
Yeah.
And as you do that, you're happier.
So, number 11, practicing spirituality or religion. People who have some type of connection to something bigger than themselves, something that's spiritual in nature, whether it be an organized, formal religion, or whether it be just a practice in their life, they're happier. The studies drilling down into this suggest that one of the reasons they're happier is that when suffering comes into their life, they're able to attach meaning to it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because you put me in a tough situation, and if I feel like I'm doing this for the good of my children or the good of the world, or even that it's making me stronger and better, that something beautiful is on the other side of this suffering, I can get through anything.
Yeah.
And I might even be halfway happy through it, right?
Right.
But you give me suffering that has no purpose, and that's hell, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's something about religion and spirituality that teaches people that what you're going through right now, what's happening in this little moment of time, it's tiny, and it's part of something bigger and something beautiful. And there's something benign and loving and intelligent that knows you and cares about you and is rooting for you. And even when it's stretching you, it has your best interest in mind.
Right. Interesting that you bring spirituality or religion, because they're not the same word. And earlier on this list are things like forgiveness and expressions of gratitude, and all these things so it kind of sounds like a primary lesson, right? Like you go to Sunday school, or you go to church or a sermon, and so it might be easy for our listeners to think, oh, whoever wrote this study might just be a religious fanatic and trying to help people to, by sharing their worldview. But it's just interesting that this is all data based. This is the best of science, and I don't actually know if this person.
This isn't your grandma telling you go to church, right?
Right. But But it's interesting that across all cultures and across, all over the world, when you look at large numbers of people, these same principles that have been passed down through religions, through government laws, through, whatever it is, like any organization worth their salt is going to try to teach people these principles of happiness, right? And so, yeah, interesting thought.
Well, that leads us to our
Last
finale,
one.
the
Yeah.
last one. Taking care of your body. Taking care of your body is number 12, whether that be through meditation, exercise, nutrition, even
Sleep.
even choosing to act like a happy person. They took a bunch of clinically depressed people and said, what do happy people, how do you know they're happy? And they said, well, they smile, they get up when the sun comes up, they go out and they walk outside. And they listed all the things that
Right.
happy people do. Then the homework was to just go and, even though you're miserable and you're depressed, just do the things. Force yourself to smile.
Yeah.
Force yourself to look at people in the eye. Force yourself to go outside. Force yourself to get up. And lo and behold, what happens when they
Yeah.
when they go back, right?
Force yourself to
All
say
these
thank
clinically
you.
depressed
Right.
people are now happy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So taking care of your body, taking care of your spirit. So my advice, this was fascinating to me. I'm sure our listeners, as they've listened to these 12 things, they're thinking, it's pretty basic stuff. And it is basic, but common sense isn't common. And the basic things don't necessarily come easily to us, right?
Yeah.
At least they don't come to me. So my advice would be to think about your life, reflect on your happiness level. And number one, believe that you can be happier, because you can,
Yeah.
right? We know there's a 40% solution. Number two, challenge the belief or the idea that you just have to have more money or you have to have this thing that's out there.
Yeah.
And then maybe choose one or two of these 12 things and just say, I'm going to consciously and mindfully bring that into my life. And I'm just going to do that for a week, 2 weeks, and then reevaluate.
Yep.
So I highly suggest that you pick up a book by this researcher. It's called The Science of Happiness, is what it is. The
Yep.
Science of Happiness. No, excuse me. The How of Happiness.
The How of Happiness.
The How of
Okay.
Happiness
Okay.
by Sonia Lombarsky. Again, I'm slaughtering her name.
Maybe. Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you for sharing your expertise and your stories and your time, and hopefully, for all of our listeners out there, this however many minute podcast will bring a little bit of happiness into your life, and hopefully some skills and some new ideas.
Until next time, everybody, keep the faith, work on your happiness, and remember mental health matters.